Outside Turin, on the night of February the 2nd, 1961, two brothers sit in a disused German bunker that they have wired with scavenged American military radios and homemade antennas. The room smells of solder and damp concrete. The older brother, Achille, is 27. The younger, Giovanni Battista, is 21. They are tuning across a band they believe is used by the Soviet space program, and at some point in the long, cold hours after midnight, they hear something they will never forget. It comes through the static slowly, a heartbeat. Heavy breathing. The heartbeat is fast, then faster, then irregular, then it begins to slow. The breathing rasps, catches, and stops. The brothers sit in the bunker in the dark, looking at each other, and they understand, or they believe they understand, that they are listening to a human being dying somewhere above the atmosphere. They reach for the spool of magnetic tape on the reel-to-reel recorder. They press record. The tape begins to turn. The bunker had a name. The brothers called it Torre Bert, and over the next 5 years, it would become one of the strangest listening posts in the world. Achille and Giovanni Battista, Judica-Cordiglia, were Italian, the sons of a Turin doctor, both of them obsessed with radio from boyhood. They had built their first crystal sets as children. By their late teens, they were licensed amateurs, and by the time Sputnik launched in October 1957, they had already cobbled together enough equipment to pick up its beeping signal from a hillside outside the city. They tracked Sputnik 2, the dog Laika's capsule, in the autumn of that year. In 1958, they intercepted telemetry from the first American satellite, Explorer 1. Reader's Digest ran a profile of them in April of 1965, calling them Italy's amateur space watchers. Western tracking authorities, Jodrell Bank in England, the United States Navy Space Surveillance System, NASA's Mini-Track Network, repeatedly confirmed that signals the brothers said they were receiving were in fact in the sky where they said they were. They were not cranks. They were skilled, obsessive, and demonstrably competent. That competence is the reason their later claims could not simply be brushed aside. By 1960, they had moved into the bunker at Torre Bert and begun building larger antennas, sweeping more bands, recruiting a small international network of fellow amateurs to corroborate receptions. They were teenagers and 20-somethings doing, in a shed outside Turin, what national intelligence agencies were spending fortunes to do. And then, sometime in 1960, the recordings began to change. The brothers, over the course of about 5 years, would publish 9 recordings they said captured the final moments of unacknowledged Soviet cosmonauts. The full list is preserved in their own self-published memoir, Dossier Sputnik, and in a long feature published in the Fortean Times in July of 2008 by the journalist Chris Hollington. The first, in May of 1960, was said to be an unnamed male cosmonaut whose capsule had veered off course. There was no recording of his voice, only telemetry the brothers interpreted as a craft tumbling out of its planned orbit. The second, on the 28th of November, 1960, was a faint Morse code signal, 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots repeated, which the brothers said came from a spacecraft on an escape trajectory, drifting outward beyond rescue. SOS. The third was the heartbeat tape from the night of February the 2nd, 1961. The fourth, in April of 1961, just days before Yuri Gagarin's official first flight, was said to be a capsule that circled the Earth 3 times before re-entering. This recording would later be tied, by conspiracy writers, to the legend of a hidden first cosmonaut named Vladimir Ilyushin, supposedly lost or crippled before Gagarin could take his place. The fifth, in May of 1961, was the famous female voice tape. A woman speaking Russian in a voice clouded by static and distortion, repeating phrases that translators would later render, "As I can see a flame," "I feel hot," "I am listening," "Will I crash?" This recording, more than any other, would haunt the popular imagination. The sixth, in October of 1961, was another off-course craft, supposedly lost into deep space. The seventh, in November of 1962, was a capsule that the brothers said had bounced off the Earth's atmosphere on re-entry, like a stone skipped across a pond, and was gone. The eighth, on the 23rd of May, 1963, was attributed to a second unnamed female cosmonaut, again burning up on re-entry, and the ninth and last, in April of 1964, was a cosmonaut whose capsule burned during atmospheric entry. 9 tapes, 9 vanished people. The brothers played them for journalists. They sold them to broadcasters. They wrote books and gave interviews, and for the rest of their lives, Achille died in 2015, Giovanni Battista in 2024, they maintained that what they had recorded was real. The case against the tapes is, by any honest standard, strong. James Oberg, an American journalist and former NASA mission control engineer who spent 30 years investigating Soviet space accidents, has written perhaps the most careful skeptical analysis. His point, made in his book Uncovering Soviet Disasters and in a long technical paper from 2007, is straightforward. The speakers on the Judica-Cordiglia tapes do not behave like Soviet cosmonauts. They use no call signs. They do not identify themselves. They do not follow standard radio protocols of the period. The formal openings, the engineering shorthand, the call and response patterns drilled into every Soviet Air Force pilot. Some of the speech contains grammatical errors. The accents do not consistently sound like native Russian. The Swedish space-tracking veteran Sven Gran, in a careful analysis of his own, came to a more sympathetic conclusion. The brothers, Gran wrote, did run a real tracking station. They did intercept genuine signals from real satellites. But once they had made the leap into sensational claims, they were trapped by them. They had to keep producing more. The most recent technical work on the tapes is even more damning. In 2025, researchers at Trinity College in Connecticut published a careful retranscription of the famous May 1961 female voice recording, the so-called Cosmonaut Ludmila tape. Working with native Russian speakers and modern audio cleanup, they found that the recording contains no references to spaceflight at all. It contains a woman counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and isolated phrases, and what one listener described as children's rhymes. The original Reader's Digest profile from 1965 mentioned almost in passing that the brothers had a sister, Maria Teresa, who had been learning Russian. And there is one more thing. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, vast archives of the Soviet space program were opened. Mark Wade, who runs the encyclopedia Astronautica, has put it this way: we know who was in the original cosmonaut team. We know who never flew. We know who was dismissed. We know who was killed in ground tests. The archives have been combed. No additional dead cosmonauts have emerged. None. So the tapes, in all probability, are not what the brothers said they were, but they are real artifacts. They were recorded. They exist. And the question they raise, were the Soviets hiding dead men, turns out, when you set the tapes aside, to have a real answer. The Soviets were, in fact, hiding dead men. Just not the ones the tapes claimed. To understand the Soviet space program's relationship with secrecy, you have to begin with what happened at Baikonur Cosmodrome on the evening of the 24th of October, 1960. On Launchpad 41 stood a prototype R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile, more than 30 meters tall, fully fueled with a propellant combination so toxic that the engineers who handled it had nicknamed it Devil's Venom. The fuel was unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine. The oxidizer was a solution of dinitrogen tetroxide in red fuming nitric acid. Either one would kill a man on contact. Together, they ignited on contact with each other. No spark, no ignition system needed, simply mix them and they burned. Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, the commander of the Soviet strategic rocket forces, was under enormous political pressure to launch this missile before the 7th of November, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The schedule was impossible. Engineering problems had piled up. Pre-launch tests were overlapping with launch preparations in a way that violated every safety protocol the program had on paper. Roughly 250 people, engineers, technicians, senior officers, were clustered around the fueled missile when they should have been in protected bunkers a safe distance away. Marshal Nedelin himself had brought out a chair and was sitting near the pad, watching the work. At 6:45 in the evening, a fault in the missile's main electrical sequencer caused the second stage engine to fire while the first stage was still beneath it. Fully fueled, the second stage exhaust ruptured the first stage tanks. The Devil's venom met itself, and the entire missile became a single enormous fireball. The people closest to the pad were incinerated where they stood. Those farther away ran, but the launch area was ringed with a barbed wire security fence, and they could not get through it. They burned at the fence. The melted asphalt of the pad area later preserved the outlines of bodies trying to crawl away. Marshal Nedelin's body was identified only by a melted medal. Mikhail Yangel, the chief designer of the missile, survived only because he had stepped away minutes earlier to smoke a cigarette behind a bunker several hundred meters away. When Khrushchev asked Yangel afterwards how he had managed to live, Yangel answered in a shaking voice, "Walked away for a smoke. It's all my fault." The official death toll given by a Soviet State Commission in 1994 was 78. Earlier estimates ranged higher. Roscosmos engineer Boris Chertok, working from his own records, put the figure at 126. The Italian Continental News Agency reported 100 dead, citing intelligence leaks, in December of 1960. British intelligence, through the Soviet spy Oleg Penkovsky, was told the figure might be as high as 300. And the Soviet Union said nothing. Khrushchev personally ordered complete secrecy. A cover story was issued. Marshal Nedelin had died in a plane crash. The families of every other man who had died at the pad were privately instructed by the state to repeat the plane crash story to their friends, their relatives, anyone who asked. They did. For decades they did. The Nedelin disaster, the single deadliest accident in the history of human rocketry, was officially acknowledged by the Soviet Union for the first time in an article published in the magazine Ogoniok in 1989, 29 years after it happened. 29 years of widows lying to their own children about how their husbands died. There is a photograph taken on the Black Sea coast in May of 1961. 6 men in identical dark suits, standing in a casual row, smiling at the camera. They are the top 6 members of the first Soviet cosmonaut class. Gagarin is there. Titov is there. Nikolaev, Popovich, Bykovsky, Nelyubov. The photo is known as the Sochi Six. But for 25 years, Soviet citizens did not see the Sochi Six photograph. They saw the Sochi Five. Grigori Nelyubov had been removed. Nelyubov was born in Crimea in 1934. He was selected as one of the original 20 cosmonauts on the 7th of March, 1960. In the final evaluation rankings of January 1961, the panel placed him 3rd behind Gagarin and Titov. He was Gagarin's second backup for Vostok 1. He was Titov's first backup for Vostok 2. He was a backup again for Vostok 3 and Vostok 4. He was, by any reasonable measure, on the verge of flying. He never did. On the 27th of March, 1963, Nelyubov and 2 other cosmonauts, Ivan Anikeyev and Valentin Filatyev, were stopped by a military patrol at Chkalovskaya station, drunk and disorderly. The duty officer reportedly offered to let the matter drop if Nelyubov would apologize. Nelyubov refused. All 3 men were dismissed from the cosmonaut corps. Nelyubov went back to flying fighter interceptors in the Soviet Far East. He drank heavily. He grew depressed. On the 18th of February, 1966, drunk, he stepped in front of a train near Ippolitovka station, northwest of Vladivostok, and was killed. The death was officially ruled a suicide, and then the airbrush came out. The Soviet authorities, to protect the public image of the space program, erased Nelyubov from group photographs. The Sochi Six became the Sochi Five. His existence in the program was simply deleted. For Western observers in the 1960s, looking at official Soviet publicity images, the visible evidence of erasure was undeniable. They could see, in some photographs, that a figure had been removed. They could not know who. They could not know why. They could only conclude that the Soviets were hiding something. Many concluded the Soviets were hiding dead cosmonauts. They were half right. The Soviets were hiding a man. He was alive when they erased him. He simply had not flown. Nelyubov's existence as a cosmonaut, the reason for his dismissal, his suicide, all of it was officially restored only during glasnost in the late 1980s. A Russian television documentary about him, called He Could Have Been the First, was finally produced in 2007. 20 days before Yuri Gagarin became the first human being in space, the youngest member of the cosmonaut corps was burning to death in a pressure chamber in Moscow. Valentin Bondarenko was 24 years old. He was Ukrainian, a fighter pilot, married, with a young son. He had been selected for cosmonaut training in 1960, along with Gagarin and the others. On the 23rd of March, 1961, he was on the final day of a 15-day low-pressure endurance experiment inside a sealed isolation chamber at the Institute of Aviation and Space Medicine. The atmosphere inside the chamber was oxygen-enriched, a procedure intended to simulate certain spaceflight conditions. He had just finished removing the biosensors from his skin. He cleaned the contact points on his chest with a piece of cotton wool soaked in alcohol. He tossed the used cotton aside without looking. It landed on an exposed electric hot plate. In the pure oxygen atmosphere, the alcohol-soaked cotton did not smolder. It flashed instantly into open flame. His woolen training suit caught fire. He could not get out. The chamber was pressurized. The door could not simply be opened. Ground crew watched through the porthole as Bondarenko burned. Equalizing the pressure took several minutes. By the time they got the door open and pulled him out, his body was burned over almost the entire surface. He died several hours later in hospital. The Soviet government classified everything. Bondarenko's name was removed from cosmonaut group photographs. His existence in the program was suppressed. His widow and son were left in a kind of limbo, knowing privately what had happened, but forbidden from telling anyone outside the family. The Soviet Union finally admitted the death in 2 short articles published in Izvestia and Krasnaya Zvezda in April of 1986, 25 years after Bondarenko died. The disclosure came in the middle of a different national mourning. The Challenger disaster had killed 7 American astronauts only weeks before. There is a grim and underappreciated coda to Bondarenko's death. On the 27th of January, 1967, 3 NASA astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, burned to death in a pure oxygen fire on the launch pad during a ground test of Apollo 1. Almost exactly the same accident. The American engineers who had designed that ground test had no idea that the Soviets had already lost a man to the same hazard 6 years earlier. The information might have saved their lives. The information was classified. A crater on the far side of the Moon, eventually named for Bondarenko after the 1986 disclosure, is one of the few formal recognitions he has ever received. On the 24th of April, 1967, the world learned for the first time that a human being had died in spaceflight. His name was Vladimir Komarov. He was 40 years old, and he had been a Soviet Air Force colonel and one of the most experienced cosmonauts in the program. Komarov had launched the previous day from Baikonur aboard Soyuz 1, the maiden crewed flight of a new spacecraft. The mission was supposed to be the headline event of the 50th anniversary year of the October Revolution. According to multiple later accounts by the Smithsonian's Air and Space magazine, the BBC, and Russian historians, the spacecraft had been pushed into flight against the strong objections of the engineering teams. Hundreds of known defects in the vehicle remained unaddressed. Yuri Gagarin, who served as Komarov's backup and who would die himself in a jet trainer crash less than a year later, had reportedly argued against the launch. Komarov flew anyway. In orbit, Almost everything that could go wrong went wrong. One of the two solar panels failed to deploy, leaving the craft underpowered. The attitude control system malfunctioned. A planned rendezvous with a second Soyuz was scrubbed. After 26.5 hours in orbit, ground control made the decision to bring him home immediately. On re-entry, the drogue parachute deployed. The main parachute did not release from its container. The reserve parachute deployed, but became entangled with the drogue. The Soyuz 1 descent module struck the steppe near Orenburg at approximately 40 meters per second. The impact crushed the capsule. The retro-rocket fuel ignited in the wreckage. Komarov became the first human being to die during a spaceflight. The Soviet Union did acknowledge his death. There was no way to hide it. The descent module had landed in front of waiting recovery crews. What the Soviet Union did not immediately acknowledge was how known the defects in his spacecraft had been before he ever left the ground. The only people who have ever died in space, meaning above the international Kármán line of 100 kilometers altitude, are three men. Their names were Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev. They were the crew of Soyuz 11. In June of 1971, they had docked with the world's first space station, Salyut 1, and become the first humans ever to live aboard one. They spent 23 days in orbit, a record. They conducted experiments. They televised broadcasts back to Earth. The mission was, in every measurable sense, a triumph. On the 30th of June, after undocking and beginning their descent, they reached the moment in the procedure where their orbital module was to separate from their descent module. 12 explosive bolts were supposed to fire in sequence to perform the separation. They fired simultaneously. The shock force jolted open a small pressure equalization valve in the descent module, at an altitude of approximately 168 kilometers above the Earth. The cabin atmosphere vented to vacuum in roughly 30 to 40 seconds. The crew were not wearing pressure suits. Soviet engineers had judged suits unnecessary for the descent phase, given the design of the Soyuz cabin and the additional weight a third crewman represented. The descent module continued on its automated re-entry trajectory. The parachutes deployed normally. The retro-rockets fired normally. The capsule touched down softly on the steppes of Kazakhstan. The recovery crews ran to the landing site, opened the hatch, and found 3 dead men still strapped to their couches. Autopsies showed hemorrhaging consistent with rapid decompression. There were dark bruises across their faces from ruptured capillaries. Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev were buried in the Kremlin wall necropolis. On the 2nd of August, 1971, the American astronauts of Apollo 15 left a small aluminium figurine on the surface of the Moon at the Hadley Apennine landing site, beside a plaque inscribed with the names of every astronaut and cosmonaut who had died in the pursuit of space exploration. The names of Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev are on that plaque. So is Komarov's, so is Bondarenko's. The figurine is still there, set everything alongside everything else, and the documented record of what the Soviet space program hid from the world is this: 78 men, possibly 126, possibly more, incinerated at Baikonur in October of 1960, their families instructed to lie about how they died for 29 years. One cosmonaut, Valentin Bondarenko, burned in a chamber in 1961, hidden for 25 years. One cosmonaut, Grigori Nelyubov, dismissed alive in 1963, airbrushed out of the photographs, dead by suicide in 1966, restored to the record only in the 1980s. One cosmonaut, Vladimir Komarov, flown to his death in a vehicle the engineers had begged not to launch. 3 cosmonauts, Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev, killed by a valve nobody had thought to engineer against. These are the men we know about. The Judica-Cordiglia tapes, for all the romance of 2 Italian brothers in a German bunker outside Turin, with their reel-to-reel tape recorders and their homemade antennas, listening across the Iron Curtain for ghosts, almost certainly do not document additional dead men. The post-Soviet archives have closed that door, but here is the part that lingers. The same archives that closed the door on the Judica-Cordiglia mythology also opened the door on Nelyubov, and on Bondarenko, and on the 78 at Baikonur. Without glasnost, without the partial collapse of the Soviet state, we would not know any of them. We would still see the Sochi 5 photograph. We would still believe Marshal Nedelin died in a plane crash. The widow of Valentin Bondarenko would still be telling her son a lie about how his father died. A state that erased that many people, that completely, for that long, did not erase them all because every single one is now accounted for. A state that erased that many people, that completely, for that long, erased them all because that is what it could do. The question the lost cosmonaut story really raises is not how many dead men the Soviets hid. The question is how anyone, anywhere, can be confident the record is now complete. The Judica-Cordiglia brothers spent the rest of their lives. Achille died at 82, Giovanni Battista at 85, insisting their tapes were real. Whether or not they were right, they understood the deeper thing earlier than most. Names can vanish. Photographs can be doctored. Disasters can be called plane crashes. 29 years of lies are not a long time in the life of a state. A man can be third on the list of the first cosmonauts and end his life under the wheels of a train near Vladivostok, and the world can be told he never existed, and it can stay told for 25 years. And it can hold. Somewhere on the far side of the moon, there is a small aluminium figurine lying in the regolith, where Apollo 15 left it in August of 1971. Beside it is a plaque. The plaque lists 14 names, the men we know about. The vanished ones, for whom there will never be a plaque, are not on it. We do not know what to write. The tape is still turning in a bunker outside Turin, in the dark.